been a while since I've taught through a book in the Old Testament. And this one I think is very relevant and very timely for what we're going through in the world right now. Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to make an attempt this morning. I feel like the last service I failed utterly, so this is one of those weeks where I'm really happy that there's multiple services that I can learn from my mistakes, and you guys can get a better version than the previous folks did that was in this room. I want to do an attempt on trying to do an introduction to the book of Ecclesiastes. Philosophically, this is a very, very challenging book to teach. The first 9 chapters of it feels like a nihilistic individual writing. It's a hopeless feeling type book, nihilistic in the sense of nihilism, a philosophical idea that nothing exists and nothing has meaning and purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche, famous philosopher of the past, kind of coined that phrase in a sense, but it goes well beyond him into basically anyone who has been a deep thinker over the years about what is the meaning of life. And you might look over your life and think, what does it even mean? Why did I come into this world? What is the point of life? What is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of existence? Does it have any meaning? Is it just a never-ending cycle of the normal common things and I'm just one of billions of other people that have ever lived, that born, lived, die, and will be forgotten, and none of this ultimately in the grand scheme of things has any meaning or value to it at all? Is that ever crossed your mind? What am I here for? And King Solomon, this is what was on his mind. This was something that he thought about very, very deeply, and we're going to see that as we read through this book. I could summarize all 12 chapters for you pretty easily. I could probably do it easily this way. Life has no meaning. The end. That was Solomon's takeaway. And it took 11 chapters of unpacking that thought. Life has no meaning. Now, to clarify it, life has no meaning under the sun. Meaning, apart from God, apart from heaven, here horizontally on earth, is there really any meaning to anything? Is there really any purpose to anything? Some of you have read the book of Ecclesiastes. And if you've ever read this book, this strange book in the Old Testament, you probably got through the first chapter and it's like, wow, that was depressing. And then you got into the second chapter, like, phew, that was even more depressing. And you get into the third chapter and you're like, this was worse than the first two. And that's how it goes. It's like, this is heavy. This is depressing. I feel sorry for people who've read the book of Ecclesiastes and they've made it all the way through 11 chapters and they get into the 12th chapter and they read the first 8 verses and then they're just like, yeah, I'm done. This book I feel so horrible just by reading this book. It's one of those strange books in the Bible where you have to make it all the way to the end. I found really big opening foundation is being laid. And the entire meaning and purpose of the book is laid out for you in the final few verses. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to get there, and I'm sure I'll allude to it from time to time, just to get our bearings straight. But it's a man who is saying these things, and I'm not saying that just so that we're clear here. I don't know if Solomon actually wrote these things. Now, I do know that Solomon said these things. There are 2 voices represented in the book of Ecclesiastes. One is the author, and the other is the speaker. The author is the guy that we're introduced to in verse number 1. He's the one who's writing these things. And you don't see him again until chapter number 12. The last couple of verses of chapter number 12, he speaks up again. But everything in between is Solomon. It is King Solomon doing all of this speaking. And what you see is a King Solomon who is an old man. He is an old man who has lived a long life. He has done more than any of us in this room or anyone that we have ever known has done. This is one of the reasons why I'm very interested in teaching through this book, because I personally find King Solomon to be one of the most unique and interesting personalities that has ever existed. There'll never be another person like King Solomon. God uniquely created and designed Solomon that way. And it's probably, it's going to be really beneficial before we even read any of the writings of King Solomon to understand a little bit about this person. So King Solomon, you have to go way back, ancient world, 10th century BC. Around the year 970 BC, King Solomon becomes king of Israel. And just so that we're clear on this, he's not some mythical character of the past. There's plenty of archaeological evidence that has been dug up of both King Solomon and of his father, King David. And so these are actual real people, as is always the case in the Bible, but I just felt like that's necessary to say. We're not talking about Greek mythology or mythical people of the past, and it may feel that way because of how grand this life is, but it's a real individual, a real person. And he was a real king. He was the king of Israel. You've, I'm sure, heard of his father, King David. King David was the second king of the nation of Israel, and through his reign, King David was able to bring the nation of Israel to a position of great prominence and power in the world. And by the time that Solomon becomes king of Israel, it is now the largest kingdom in the world. And Solomon takes it to a whole new level. Solomon was the fourth son of King David. I believe King David had 18 wives. Not recommended, and he had many children. King Solomon, if I remember right, was the fourth of them, but he was the second son of Bathsheba. And if you remember the story there between David and Bathsheba. I only mention that because it's important that you understand that Solomon was not in line to become king. He should not have become king. But this was by God's design and by God's purpose. He was very young when he became king. David, knowing that his days were numbered, his hours really were numbered, brings Solomon into his chamber, begins to give him instructions on what to do after his passing, and that he was going to keep his promise to Bathsheba that Solomon will be king. And part of those instructions that David, his father, gives to Solomon is somewhat of a hit list. These are some guys that have not treated me right. Don't let them grow to have gray hairs, and make sure that they have no peace in their life. And so he's like, take care of some of these loose ends for me, if you would. And then he gives him some biblical advice on things that he should do in his life as well, which was all needful because Solomon became king as a teenager. The first century historian Josephus tells us that he was 14 years old when he became king. Now, if you go through the book of Kings and Chronicles, and you calculate and you do the math, it almost seems and appears like he was probably closer to the age of 18. It's hard to know for certain, but this we can be assured of. He was a teenager. He was a young man. And before God comes to him, and I don't want to get ahead of the story here, but God comes to him and grants him whatever wish that he wants, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But before that event happens, it seems that Solomon's not the brightest kid in the world. Right before that happens, now he's a spiritual kid, but he's not the brightest kid. And before that happens, he marries a woman who is from Egypt. It is Pharaoh's daughter, and that was mistake number one. That's one of 1,000 mistakes that he'll make in the future. But he's already, before God even comes to him and brings him into a place of great wisdom, he's already beginning to make some mistakes as the new king. But even though he's making mistakes, he is pursuing God. He does love God. And he wants to rule God's kingdom in a godly and biblical way. Now, Solomon is kind of the inverse of the rest of the world. He begins his life in his youth pursuing God, loving God, and living right for God. And as he ages, he gets worse and worse. He falls away from God. You get to 1 Kings chapter 11, and it begins to describe how his heart was no longer with the Lord. And God lays down, you could say, these curses on what will happen, these judgments on what will happen to his life because of that. But here he is as a young man. probably anywhere between 14, 18 years old. He's now the leader, the king of the largest kingdom in the world at this point. And God comes to him in the middle of the night in a dream, and God tells Solomon, this is the only person God has ever done this to. God tells him, I'll give you whatever you want, just ask me about it. 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us about this. Now, could you imagine if God came to you and just said, whatever you want, name it. Name it. What do you want? What would you like to have? And have you ever thought about that? If God could, God owns everything, God has everything, and God can do anything. What if God came to me like he did to Solomon and said, I'll give you whatever you want? Some of you are like, a couple of $1 million or, health or whatever. It's like spiritual. Give me peace on earth and everybody reads their Bible and loves you. It's like, there'd be different ideas. I was thinking about this yesterday morning. If God came to me and said, you can have whatever you want, what would I ask for? I thought about it for a moment, and then I thought, just take me straight to heaven. Like if ultimately everything's going that direction anyway, why do I care to be here anymore? Why do I care to try to make earth more heavenly-like? Why don't I just go to heaven? So it's like, just skip all this part, take me straight to the conclusion of everything. So that was kind of what I was thinking. But could you imagine if God asked you, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Years ago, I heard a story about a couple. They were at a beautiful place, a tropical location. They were celebrating their anniversary. They had both recently turned 60 years old, and they had a wonderful life of marriage together, and they were enjoying this time walking out on the beach, and they came across a little oil lamp in the sand, and they picked it up, and as they were trying to figure out what it was that they were holding, they were rubbing it, and a genie popped out of the bottle. It's a true story, so go with me. And then this genie begins to speak to them and tells this couple, I'll give both of you one wish. Whatever it is that you want, just ask, and I'll give it to you. We'll let ladies go first. So, ma'am, what would you like to have? And she thought about it for a moment, and she said, this week has been such a wonderful week. I'd love to just live this week for the rest of my life. So she said, could we both live on a deserted tropical island together in happiness and peace for the rest of our life and just be there together? And the genie said, your wish is my command. And poof, there they were on a deserted island. All of their life's needs, it seems, are taken care of. And so he turned to the gentleman and he said, what would you like to have? And he's thinking, we're both 60 years old, and here we are in this beautiful tropical island for the rest of our existence. This is really nice. I think I know what I want. And so he asked, I would like for my wife to be 30 years younger. And just like that, poof, he became 90 years old. The moral of the story is be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you ask for. And so God comes to Solomon and says, you're a young man. You're now the leader of the largest kingdom in the world. What do you want? I'll give you the heads of your enemies. I'll give you power. I'll give you wealth. I'll give you fame. I'll give you whatever you want. And Solomon, being young and also being wise, he said, I would like understanding. I would like wisdom. I don't know how to lead your people. I don't know how to lead your kingdom. I feel like a foolish individual. And the request pleased God greatly that he had asked for this. And so God tells Solomon, because you didn't ask for the heads of your enemies, and you didn't ask for wealth, and you didn't ask for power, and you didn't ask for fame, and you didn't ask for all these other things that other people would have asked for, but you asked for knowledge and wisdom so that you could honor me and so that you could help people. He said, I'll give you all the other stuff as well. And that began, that's the start of what would grow to become the greatest, perhaps, king and the greatest kingdom that the world has ever known. Not in the moral sense, but in the sense of what he was able to accomplish in the 40 years that he was king of Israel. He spent the first part of that time, like immediately after that, he began this brilliance of mind. It was, in fact, if you read First Kings, as soon as God had granted him this wisdom, he's in this court situation to where two harlots are bringing a child before him, and he's asking for, they're asking, what to be done about it. I'm not going to get into the story of that, but at the end of that story, what happens is the rest of the kingdom realize this king is smart. He is wise. Nobody would have ever thought to handle this situation the way he did. And his fame began to spread. So people started writing down the things that Solomon was saying. 1 Kings chapter 4 tells us that in his lifetime there was recorded over 3,000 proverbs. And he had written over 1,005 songs, most of which have been lost to time. We have in the Bible, there's 3 books in the Old Testament that emerged from King Solomon. You have the book of Proverbs, which is a collection of the wise sayings and statements of King Solomon. You have Song of Solomon, a book about love, and even theologically it goes deeper and beyond that. And then you have Ecclesiastes. And they're kind of in that order as well, even though they may not be in that order in your Bible, but that kind of reflects his life. As a young man, wise and saying wise things and teaching wise things and giving wise instruction, and he had so much to say, but in his latter days, for being the wisest man in the world, he ended up doing some of the dumbest things any person could ever do. But I don't want to jump ahead of myself. In his younger days, he spent a lot of his time building. In fact, King Solomon, historians will tell you that other than Ramses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, very few people in history have built as much as King Solomon. He spent 14 years, and they've estimated anywhere up to $4 trillion in modern amounts, building so much. He built up the nation of Israel over such a short period of time. He spent 13 years building his own palace. He spent 7 years building the temple, which we all know as Solomon's temple, long ago destroyed, and the world, would love to have seen what it would look like. One of the wonders of the world. In fact, Solomon's kingdom itself was one of the wonders of the world. Kings and queens from all over the world wanted to travel to come and see Solomon's kingdom and his wisdom, and to see these amazing things. They weren't just big buildings. They were big buildings that were filled with gold and silver and precious stones. And the wealth of Solomon was far beyond what you could imagine. It says that because he had expanded the territories of Israel, and he had bridged out the gap between the Mediterranean Sea and the desert to the east, that all territory was now belonged to Israel. In order for people to travel north and south, they had to go through Israel. So all nations north of the nation of Israel and all nations south of Israel, now in order to travel and to do business with one another, they had to go through the land of Israel. And so he taxed them pretty high to do that. And in the midst of that, he started making his own business agreements with them. And so it not only got to where nations were trading with one another north and south, but that most of their trading began to be focusing in on Israel. So much so that the Bible tells us that in the days of Solomon, that silver became almost worthless. Kind of like the way you see a penny laying on the ground these days. Like, should I bend over and pick it up? I don't know. It's a penny. That's kind of how they felt about silver. And gold was in abundance. The Bible tells us that from just the taxation on the roads and the amount of business that he was doing with the other nations around him, that over 2,500 tons of gold was brought in every year. This week I took my calculator out and I was trying to figure out what would that be worth. And 1 ton of gold today is valued at $58,987,000. That's a lot of money, but that's 1 ton. 25 tons would be $1,474,000,000. That's what he was bringing in just from the north and the south, the travel going through. The Bible says that does not include the additional revenue that he received from merchants and traders and all the kings of Arabia and the governors of their lands, and all of the tax that he taxed the residents of Israel heavily. That became a burden of them later on. And even the kings and queens that came to visit him brought him immense amount of wealth. It's calculated that when the Queen of Sheba came to visit Solomon, that she brought with her, just in her gifts, over $8 million worth of stuff. Solomon was bringing in the money. I mean, just tons and tons, literally, tons and tons of money. Now, you would think that because of all of this, there would be lots of wars. If you're that wealthy, if you're that rich, if you're doing that well, all of the other empire builders, all of the other kings who covet what is always out there that they don't have, you'd think there'd be lots of wars. But in Solomon's reign, there were almost no wars. If you remember, his father was he lived his entire life battling. He was a warrior king. Solomon himself almost had no wars, no battles. And that was all due to his wisdom, but it was also due to his strength in his kingdom. His military was without parallel. The Bible tells us that there were 40,000 stalls of horses for his military. 40,000 stalls, not horses. 40,000 stalls for his horses. The Bible tells us that there were 12,000 men in the infantry. It says that there were over 1,400 chariots. That'd be kind of like their army takes of that day. And no other king would want to attack Israel. They would send spies in and get a good estimate of what it is that they're about to go to war against, and realize, like, no, we can't do that. So there was peace through strength in this case, as is almost always the case. And in his building program, I talked about, he built the temple, he built his palace, he built all of these other structures, many, many structures in the nation of Israel, and that required quite a bit of laborers. The Bible tells us that there were over 80,000 stonecutters that he hired. 80,000 stonecutters. There were over 70,000 common laborers that he hired to work for him. And there were over 3,600 managers and overseers of the projects that he was working on. And let's not misunderstand here. We're not talking about laborers just in Israel. Solomon thought beyond the walls of Israel, and he had projects that were going on in many of the port cities of the Middle East. He had projects going on in what would be southern-day Arabia. He had projects all over. There's estimates, there's talks that perhaps even Solomon had mines that stretched all the way even to the west here. So Solomon was thinking well beyond just the nation of Israel, and he was making connections and doing trade, and he had shipping ports all over the Middle East. This work, as I said, he spent 14 years building and amassing an empire that no one of that time could comprehend. When the Queen of Sheba came to visit him, she said, "I've heard the stories, but they pale in reality of what my eyes are seeing. The half has not been told," she said. And so Solomon was powerful, and he had a powerful kingdom. He had a powerful palace. Like I said, he spent 13 years building his own house, and thousands of workers to build it. A lot of people lived in his house. 1 Kings gives us a description of what the daily provisions of food were for King Solomon's palace. Now, this is interesting. So you think about, with inflation and everything, you think about how much does groceries cost your home, and how much food do you have to buy for your house on a weekly, monthly basis. Now listen to this. This is Solomon's grocery list. This is his grocery list for every day. Every day, to feed Solomon's house, not kingdom, to feed Solomon's house. The Bible says that he needed every day 337 bushels of fine flour. He needed 674 bushels of meal. He needed 10 stall-fed oxen. He needed 20 pasture-fed oxen. He needed 100 sheep and goats, and sometimes deer and gazelle and choice fowl. That is for daily meals. Every day, that's how many cows and deer and gazelle and how many bags of wheat and meal needed to come in order to feed the mouths in his own house. That's hard for me to fathom. Could you imagine how many farmers that required just to feed his house? And so maybe you get a sense of just how big and powerful Solomon was. And you might ask the questions, well, did Solomon eat that much? Was he a big fat guy? How many people lived in his house? Well, let's put some things into context here. Solomon, this is one of the dumb things that he did. He decided, I think I really like women. And so he decided, I'll have 700 wives. And you're like, well, that's pretty dumb. Yeah, that was dumb, but that's not, on top of that, he's like, you know what, this is pretty good, but I could get 300 girlfriends too. So he gets 300 concubines. That's over 1,000 women. That's a lot of children too, by the way. A lot of mouths to feed. And you might think, well, why in the world would a man want 700 wives and 300 concubines? Well, for one, because he can. He can do whatever he wants. He's the king of the world, so to speak. He can have whatever he wants. He just snaps his finger, give it to me. But a lot of this had more to do with trade and doing business with the other nations. A lot of it had to do with protecting the borders and safety of his own nation. If he marries the daughters of all these other kings, then it's less likely that they're going to attack his kingdom. If he marries the daughters of all these wealthy leaders, then there can be trade between them because now we're family. And so Solomon was thinking more on how he could grow his wealth and grow his fame and grow his power. It's not as much about sex, but a lot of that was involved as well, because Solomon admits to that later on, that he just wanted to live life and please himself however he wanted. And that's what I want to get to here. Solomon did that. Yes, he was knowledgeable on almost everything. The Bible says that he dabbled in philosophy, he dabbled in botany, he dabbled in everything you can think of. He had a very obviously curious mind. Whatever popped into his head, he wanted to know everything there was to know about it. Well-versed, well-studied individual, and I would probably even argue perhaps the smartest man who's ever lived. Perhaps the wisest man. The Bible tells us that. Wisest man who ever lived. But in spite of that giftedness that was given to him, he squandered it. He threw it away by again and again doing the most foolish things you could imagine. And the Bible says that because of that, his heart began to be turned away from God. Let me read 1 Kings chapter 11, verse number 1. It says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites and the Ammonites and Edomites and Hittites." And if you know the Old Testament, this is a list of Israel's enemies. It says, "From the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after other gods." And that's the reason why this restriction was here. It wasn't that God didn't want interracial marriage. It was because God didn't want Solomon's heart or the people of the nation. He didn't want their hearts turned to the other pagan gods. But it says that Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives and princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart, for it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So Solomon, as a young man, seems to have begun well in life, but he certainly did not end well. He may have been the most powerful man in all of the world, but he wasn't spiritual and he wasn't godly. He may have been the wisest man in the world as far as knowledge and understanding goes, but he didn't act on it. I had a good friend like that growing up, Russell Donaldson. The man was brilliant when it comes to, most of you guys, whether you realize this or not, you know nothing about women at all. You know nothing about women. Russ was one of those weird guys. It's like he understood the female mind. He understood what was making them tick. And so I talked to Russ, back in the days when I was dating Anna. I was like, why does she do this? Why does she say, why does she act? And Russ would just break it right down. It's like, well, women think this way, and they do this, and this is how they feel. I was like, oh, I would have never thought of that. And Russ was just this kind of guy. He had a lot of wisdom to life and understanding of life, but boy, he did not have a clue on how to live it out himself. He made all kinds of bad decisions in his life, even though he was wonderful at giving, great advice and understanding. Just because you have it in your head and maybe even in your heart, you may know what's right, it doesn't mean you always do what's right. And Solomon is certainly that case of the guy who knew it all, understood it all, and still let his fallen, depraved nature call the shots and do the wrong thing. And in the end of his life, you could imagine the regret, you could imagine the sorrow, you could imagine looking back at what God had given him and realizing, I did not take advantage of it. And plus, in the end, asking the grand question, what was the meaning of life to begin with? Did any of this have value at all? And with that said, I know that was the insanely long introduction, but we won't spend long in the chapter here. I'm just going to read some verses. Look at verse number 2. Actually, let's go back to we'll go to verse 1. We didn't even read that, did we? Verse number 1. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, nowhere in the book does it tell us that King Saul or King Solomon is the one who wrote this, but that opening line there tells us that it was King Solomon, and here's the reason why. He says that the one who is speaking is the son of King David, who is also himself king of Jerusalem. Now, David only had one son who ever became king in Jerusalem, and that was Solomon. So it couldn't be anyone else. Plus, as you read the rest of the book, it becomes very clear. In every single chapter, there are descriptions of the person speaking that can only apply to King Solomon. So Solomon is the one who is the one speaking these things, and he refers to himself as the preacher, the teacher, the instructor, which goes right along with the title of the book. It's called Ecclesiastes. That's a Greek word. It's a Greek word that means the one who assembles the congregation. Well, who is the one who assembles the congregation? That's the pastor, that's the preacher, that's the teacher. The Greek word Ecclesiastes is also where we get another Greek word, that ecclesia. And for those who have been in church for a while, you're like, oh, I've heard of the word ecclesia. That's the word that we use for church, the called out ones. And so King Solomon saying, I'm the preacher, I'm the teacher, and I'm calling the assembly together because I've got some things to tell you. There's some stuff I need to get off my chest. Well, what does he need to get off his chest? Well, verse number 2, this is his message. He says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities. All is vanity. Okay, welcome to church today. That's not exactly the message I think you might have wanted to hear. Some of you, your Bible translation says meaningless. Meaningless, meaningless, says the preacher. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. That's kind of the idea here. Now, there's a Hebrew word there. Hevel is the word that's used. And he uses it 38 times throughout this whole book. He uses it over and over again. Hevel, hevel. Everything is hevel. It's hevel. Now, there's no English equivalent to that Hebrew word hevel. It's one of those old ancient words. It's very difficult to comprehend fully. But it has the idea of more of a mist, a vapor, a smoke, things that are fleeting, things that cannot be grasped. Maybe a best way to think about it is if you've ever seen a soap bubble floating in the air and you go to grab it and it pops. That's hevel. It appears to be solid. It appears to be real, but as soon as it's gone. It's just not graspable. And that is the word here, hevel. And he uses it again and again. He opens the book with that statement. He closes the book. Chapter 12, verse number 8, he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. I think he learned this from his father. King David spoke in the same way. King David once said in Psalm 39, verse number 5, indeed, you have made my days as a handbreadth, and my age as if it were nothing before you. Certainly every man at his best state is nothing but vapor, is nothing but hevel. So King David teaching says that even man in his prime, even man at his best condition, he is nothing more than hevel. He's nothing more than vapor. It's just here today and gone tomorrow. Many, many years into the future, James, the half-brother of Jesus, will make a similar statement that life and man and us is nothing more than vapor. It's here today and gone tomorrow. And if you're wondering, what does Solomon mean by that? What is hevel to him? What does it mean to him? Well, fortunately, he explains to us what it means to him multiple times. Verse 14, he says, I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind. That phrase there, grasping for the wind, he says it 9 times. And he always connects it to hevel. So he says, it's all vanity, it's meaningless. What do I mean by that? What I mean is it's grasping for the wind. It's grasping for, you're trying to grab a hold of life, but then it slips away. It's gone. You're trying to grab a hold of the meaning and the purpose of life, and it's gone. It slips away. That's what Solomon means when he says hevel, when he says vanity or meaningless. So that's the premise, by the way, of the whole book. You're like, that's in the Bible? That doesn't sound biblical. Once again, you need to understand the point of this book. And the point of this book, I think, is most understood by wedding what he says in verse 2, meaningless, all is meaningless, with what he says in verse 3. Read verse 3. He says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? That phrase there, under the sun, underlines the whole point of the book. He says that line 32 times in this book. Under the sun, under the sun. It's all meaningless under the sun, under the sun. So what is my point here? And really it's Solomon's point. Everything in this world, everything in life, everything that you understand as reality, in the end, if you're a thinking person, ultimately, it's meaningless under the sun, here on earth, horizontally. If your perspective is just, well, what's going on earth? What's going on among humanity? If that's the only perspective you have, then you'll come to the same conclusion as all other famous philosophers of the past have, is some type of a skepticism, some type of a nihilism, some type of a sense that nothing exists and nothing matters and it's all meaningless, and it's a rotating circle that goes around and around and around and around, and ultimately nothing matters. In the end, the grand scheme of things, nothing matters down here on earth. But that's viewing life horizontally. Now, if you view life vertically, where you understand there is a God, He has created everything, He controls everything, He is sovereign over everything, then you have a totally radically different perspective. And then you begin to understand that even though it appears that nothing has meaning, there must be meaning. Because there is a meaningful God who is controlling it. And so, I respect anyone who is an atheist and a nihilist at the same time. I respect them, because at the end of the day, there's only 2 options on the table. Either there is a God, and He's in control, and He is the one that gives meaning and purpose to everything, or there's not, and there is no purpose and meaning. If you fall somewhere in between, you haven't thought long enough. You haven't rationed this out well enough yet. And eventually you'll end up over here to where nothing matters. So I respect anyone who ultimately makes it to that category. But I don't want any of you to be in that category. Obviously, God doesn't want you to be in that category. And so He took the time to make sure that a book was written in His Bible so that anyone who ends up ultimately in that category would be drawn out of it and put into the category. There is a God, life does have meaning, and it has purpose, and that your existence is not just a nihilistic existence, but that you are here for a reason, and you're never going to find that reason under the sun. You're going to have to look beyond that. Maybe play on words here, look past the sun, S-U-N, and to the Son, S-O-N, the Creator and Sustainer, as Colossians 1:16 tells us of all things. And so he says in verse number 2, what profit has man from all his labor in which he toils? Now let's very quickly here read through these remaining verses. Verses 4 through 10, the grand idea here is that nothing ever changes and nothing is new. He says in verse number 4, one generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. People are born, people die, the earth stays the same. Nothing changes in the world. Verse 5, the sun also rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, they return again. If you didn't notice, by the way, he's getting very scientific here. In an ancient world, 3,000 years ago, he's understanding how the clouds work, how the wind patterns of the world work, how this system of the snow melts on the top of the mountains and it comes down into the valley and it ultimately makes its way to the ocean. But the ocean never overflows. How is that possible? Well, because it evaporates, it goes back into the sky and it starts over again. It's just the cycle of life over and over and over again, and nothing ever changes. Verse 8, all things are full of labor, and man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. Man never changes. Man always sees more than he can have, and he wants more than he can have, and he's not satisfied with what he hears, and he's not satisfied with what he sees, and he's never satisfied. There's always the pursuit of happiness, but there's never the achievement of happiness. There's just the pursuit, and it's just an endless cycle of pursuit over and over and over again. Verse number 9, that which has been is what will be, that which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. On earth, nothing is new. There's nothing, we're coming up on an election year, and there's a particular gentleman, he's a philosopher, and he's almost always accurate. I think there's been one or two times he hasn't been, but he's almost always accurate on his predictions of who's going to be elected president. And the man doesn't study politics, doesn't care about politics. He doesn't even look into politics. He studies people. He studies human nature. He says, people are the same. They do the same things. All you got to do is know people, know the routines, know the cycles of what's going on in society. And I can almost tell you always who's going to be elected next just because I'm following the patterns. And Solomon's saying these people never change. There's nothing new under the sun. Verse 10, he says, is there anything of which it might be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. You can't look around the world around you and go, oh man, this has never happened before. Yeah, it has. Oh, this is new. Nobody's ever thought that before. Yeah, they have. There's nothing new. What's funny here is, so you have an ancient man in ancient times saying that nothing has changed since ancient times. So Solomon, looking back over the previous 3,000 years of human history from his perspective, says nothing's changed. Here I am, 3,000 years into the future from Solomon's time, looking back to him, an ancient man, going, well, I can verify now, Solomon, you're correct, because you looked at your 3,000 years and nothing has changed, and another 3,000 years has passed. I look back and go, yep, nothing's changed either. You're right. Nothing ever changes. Look at verse number 11. Everything and everyone is eventually forgotten. There is no remembrance, he says, of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. I, the preacher, was keen over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of man by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. No matter how much you want to make things right in the world, that's not going to happen. You can't fix the broken system that's there. Verse 16, he says, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have obtained greatness, and I've gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases in knowledge increases in sorrow. Why is that? How is it that with all this wisdom and all this knowledge, he become more sad? Because the more he learned, the more he understood, how broken and depraved the whole system is, how meaningless everybody's pursuits are. They set out this task like, oh, this is going to make me happy, and that's going to make me happy, and this is going to give me purpose, and that's going to give me purpose. And he watches the lives of people unfold in front of it, and things that are just don't turn out with the blessing that you think, and the things that are unjust turn out with blessing and didn't make any sense. And as we go through the rest of this book, you'll come to realize that nothing in life made any sense under the sun. Nothing on earth has any meaning and makes any sense. And this is why we have to look past the earth. This is why you have to look past the present and the physical and to realize there is the spiritual and there is God. And God has a plan and God has a purpose. Although we may not fully grasp or understand all of it, we know this, that His plans are for you to have life with Him. Not for you to find meaning and purpose in this created realm, but for you to realize how meaningless and empty and vain it is so that you would pursue Him for the spiritual eternal one. This is why Jesus said in John 10 and verse number 10, I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly.